Good afternoon. I am Dr. Ria David, President of Cybergenetics. I'd like to welcome everyone attending this webinar on DNA computer interpretation. We're very pleased that everybody could join us. We hope that you find this webinar informative and useful. At the end of the webinar, there will be a brief survey, and if you could answer it, that would be very helpful. Also, if people have questions, they can always contact us via the internet, via email. Our contact information is at our website. Without further ado, our first speaker today will be Lindsay Ferrara. Lindsay is adjunct faculty at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh in the Forensic Science program. She has been a bench analyst with the Army Lab doing DNA forensics. She's also a member of the cybergenetics team specializing in DNA computer interpretation. She will be providing a brief introduction to DNA, forensic science, and computer interpretation. Thank you, Lindsay, for your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. David. Now, before we explore how computers interpret evidence, we must start at the beginning by looking at where the evidence comes from. At a crime scene, there's many types of evidence collected, from fingerprints to fibers, and usually some form of biological material is present. Now, this biological material can be sent forward for DNA analysis. But just because you're collecting biological material doesn't mean all DNA evidence is created equal. For instance, if you have a knife that is covered in blood, it may yield a simple DNA profile. But if you have a sexual assault kit, that's a more complex sample. This would actually be a mixture item. And a mixture item refers to a sample that contains DNA from two or more people. As you can see, the initial evidence collected at a crime scene can range from something simple to process to a very complex item. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the show CSI. And a common theme in this show is that all cases get solved in an hour, and in terms of DNA, they almost always find it, and it yields a perfect match to their suspect. Unfortunately, real-life cases don't always work out as well as they do on TV. But shows like this have created a CSI effect that has integrated into our society. There's now a greater expectation that DNA can solve most crimes. Society in general is not the only one with higher expectations for DNA analysis. Police investigators expect DNA to be processed quickly so that the results can be used to aid in their investigation, while victims and their families expect DNA to be processed and yield results in order to bring closure. And prosecutors believe they are receiving the best results possible, which unfortunately may not always be the case. So now that we've collected the evidence at the crime scene, it's sent forward to a DNA laboratory for processing. And labs are continually increasing their ability to process DNA evidence through the use of automation and advanced technology. The laboratory utilizes various robots and machines in order to take an evidence sample all the way through the process and produce a final DNA profile. One of the last steps in the process requires the use of a genetic analyzer, like the one shown here. This instrument produces vast amounts of DNA data that must be interpreted. It is at this interpretation step where analysts may run into some speed bumps. Let us recall the earlier example where you have a large amount of blood on a knife found at a crime scene. This relates to a large quantity of DNA, which may produce a clean profile from a single person. A sample like this is easy for an analyst to look at and interpret. Unfortunately, the majority of evidence encountered in a DNA lab is much more complex, and in many cases, too difficult for human interpretation. I'd like to describe some examples of complex mixtures, since they can cover a wide range of evidence items. These samples may contain anywhere from 2 to 5 or more individuals within a single evidence item. One example of a complex mixture involves touch DNA. Touch DNA refers to a sample where a small amount of starting material is present. Now, this may be encountered when investigators swab a gun used in a crime. If multiple people have used this gun, you now have low-level DNA from at least 2 people. And let's take this example one step further and think about a gun that was shared by 2 brothers. Due to the fact that 2 individuals that make up this mixture sample are related, the complexity of this mixture increases and the interpretation becomes that much more difficult. So many of these complex mixtures are not able to be fully interpreted by humans, in part because of the interpretation guidelines they must follow. Therefore, these evidence items end up with inconclusive results, which means valuable DNA data is thrown away. Due to this loss of data, there's a limited amount of information uploaded to the CODIS database. And this can have an additional impact on society. Due to failed interpretation methods, useful DNA data that you don't know exists is discarded due to its complex nature. So how do we fix that problem? This is where the use of computers for DNA interpretation can alleviate the loss of information. While human analysts can only interpret what they see, computers can analyze the data at hundreds of dimensions, and supercomputers can perform data mining by exploring the available data to capture more information than is possible for a human. Compared to human interpretation, computers are capable of interpreting the data better, faster, more accurately, and objectively. Data that was previously thought to be inconclusive or produced a low match statistic may actually contain useful information if analyzed using computers. That's where cybergenetics and the TrueAllele computer systems come in. For almost 20 years, cybergenetics has been working to automate DNA interpretation. They have experience working with both prosecution and defense lawyers to analyze data, and they were also asked to analyze the data from the World Trade Center, which is pictured here, in order to help identify victims. In addition, they work with police investigators and the Innocence Project in order to find the true perpetrator of a crime. Additionally, they are developing more powerful DNA databases to incorporate more information. Cybergenetics is a key innovator in advancing the power of DNA by having computers analyze the data. This webinar will focus on the use of TrueAllele casework and database systems to interpret the DNA data that is typically discarded. Thank you. Now I'd like to turn it back over to Dr. David.
Thank you, Lindsay. I hope that was a useful introduction to computers and DNA interpretation. Our next presenter is Dr. Mark Perlin. Dr. Perlin is Chief Scientific and Executive Officer at Cybergenetics. He has 20 years' experience developing computer methods for information-rich interpretation of DNA evidence and for providing TrueAllele products and services to the criminal justice community. I'm sure that you'll find his talk about DNA, crime scene evidence, and computer interpretation informative. Thank you, Dr. Perlin.
Hi, good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. Today I'll be talking about DNA knowledge and DNA power and how computers can be used to interpret DNA evidence. For some of you who are not completely conversant with DNA typing, I just want to show a quick slide to remind us all what a DNA genotype is. We have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and if you zoom in on one region of a chromosome and you are examining a location, which is called a locus, that is inherited and contains linear text, just letters from the DNA alphabet A, C, G, and T. There are particular genetic loci that are very useful in forensics for identifying people, and they have sentences that vary based on the number of repeating words. So if you look on the bottom left of the slide, you'll see that here's a repeating word, I say 4 letters long, ACGT, that repeats 10 times. And that's one genetic variant, say inherited from the mother, which is an allele of length 10. And say an individual on their locus on the other chromosome, inherited from the father, has an allele that has 12 repeats. So that molecule, instead of being 40 letters long, would be 48 letters long. And that pairing of those two lengths, the 10 repeats and the 12 repeats of that pair of alleles, is what a genotype is. So at one locus, a person has a genotype that is a definite pair of alleles with trillions of copies throughout their body, and there may be many locations that are used, and these particular locations are chosen because they have many different alleles that allow for many, many different allele pairs that can help distinguish people. So the DNA identification pathway begins with an evidence item found at a crime scene, and then the laboratory transforms this evidence item. What I'm showing is DNA from a single individual, maybe in abundant quantity, and then from that, evidence data is derived. The evidence data shows peaks where the alleles are by length. Here's a 10 and a 12 that would correspond to a genotype at one locus of this individual. From this very clean and simple data, one can readily infer that the genotype is the 10-12 that corresponds to the two peaks, which are the two lengths of alleles that the person has. Once that genotype is inferred as a 10-12, comparison can get made to a known genotype and a match can be declared. How much information is in a match? Well, the concept of a match statistic is to ask at the suspect's genotype, do we have an identification that's a true match, or is it just a coincidence? So if you look all the way on the left, you can see that before we ever gather data, the chance that a person has a particular genotype, or that you would match with that genotype, is just whatever that prevalence of the allele pair, say 10-12 is, at a locus in the population. Maybe it's only 5%. After examining the data, we definitely see with simple single source data that the evidence is telling us that it's a 10-12. We know the genotype. So when we compare the evidence to the match, we're 100% confident that the evidence matches a suspect. And then when we divide by the chance of a coincidence, the chance of finding a random person with that genotype, which in this case on the right in the denominator is 5%, we get a ratio of 20. At this locus, that match statistic would be a 20, and that could be multiplied by 10 or 15 other match statistics from other loci. It's a very simple situation because the match is definite. With DNA mixture data, which is becoming the prevalent form of DNA evidence in the US and other countries, we can have more than one person in the evidence. What we see here is that here's on the x-axis is the size of increasing length of DNA fragments, and on the peak tops you see they're labeled as 7, 10, 12, 14, and then the heights labeled on the y-axis as RFU give you a measure of how much DNA was present. So for example, at the peak labeled 10, that would be an allele of length 10, that has 10 repeats, which you can tell from the x-axis. The y-axis is giving you 300 relative fluorescence units, and the 10 and the 12 have about the same peaks. They might come from one person, whereas an allele pair of a 7 and a 14 might be coming from a second person. This is what quantitative data looks like when it comes off the genetic analyzer. So the problem with mixtures, which again in many labs is most of the DNA evidence, and with other degraded or low template DNA, is that the DNA pathway can be broken. While the lab can analyze a mixture, shown here on the left as 2 individuals, and produce data, which is a cartoon of what we just saw on the last slide, with peaks at 7, 10, 12, and 14 of varying heights, it becomes harder for simple human interpretation protocols to infer evidence genotypes like what was possible when there was only one answer. Here there may be multiple possibilities, and so the genotypes are not inferred, and once you can't infer a genotype, it becomes harder to make a direct comparison with a known genotype or to produce a strength of match. Here are some human interpretation issues with less straightforward DNA. On the evidence side, good DNA can be considered inconclusive. The DNA peaks may be too low for people to reliably analyze. There may be too many contributors in a mixture for them to handle. Some labs won't analyze beyond 2 contributors, say. And there's always a potential for examination bias, as recent papers have reported. On the database side, for investigative applications, DNA hits are made by association, asking if alleles are included, not by matching genotypes. And the result of that is these databases that are based on alleles and inclusion have a natural tendency, when a comparison is made, to make false hits. In order to compensate for that, policies are put in place to restrict the upload of DNA evidence and mixtures. And because evidence is not available on the database, the true hits that might find a criminal are lost. A computer like TrueAllele that does genotype modeling, on the other hand, can make more use of the same evidence data. It can preserve more of the identification information that's in the data. It can use all the peaks, whether they're high or low, with any number of contributors, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. And in terms of never seeing the suspect before it reaches a conclusion, it's entirely objective. The process infers its genotypes solely from the data, only makes comparisons afterwards, and is not susceptible to that type of bias. On the database side, a genotype database makes hits based on computing a match statistic. And studies that we and others have done show that this type of match comparison with a number instead of a all or none inclusion or exclusion can be very sensitive and find only the true hits, and very specific in that false hits are not found. In this way, using a computer to interpret the DNA evidence, the DNA pathway is restored. Starting from the same mixture data, an evidence genotype can be inferred. Now the uncertainty can be computed by the calculator and give you probabilities. So at one locus, we're looking at one of the contributors. Here's a listing of possible genotypes, a 1010, a 1012, a 1014, and they have associated probabilities that add up to 100%. that evidence genotype known up to probability for a contributor to a mixture can then be, after it's inferred, compared with a known genotype in order to compute a match statistic. So what happens when you compute the match statistic? What happens is that because the probability of the matching genotype here, say, is only 50% instead of 100%, the numerator for that genotype comparison is reduced to 50%. The denominator stays the same. The coincidence is still 5%. So now the ratio of 50% over 5% of a identification match versus a coincidental match is reduced from 20 down to 10. But you end up with the weight of evidence that the data contained instead of reporting the results as inconclusive or with much lower match statistics. So I'd like to give an example from a ganged case that I testified in earlier this year in Kern County, California. In this crime, there was a gang, and they were moving throughout Kern County, committing crimes and leaving DNA at some of them. And there were evidence from at least 5 different crime scenes: a food mart, hardware store, jewelry store, convenience store, food market. And the laboratory had developed 12 evidence items shown on the left from the 5 different scenes. And the nature of the items: from scene 1 was a gun and a hat, from scene 2 a safe, a phone, and so on, going down the list. Typically had 3 or 4 contributors to them. They were highly complex mixtures that the lab felt might be safer to be interpreted by computer right off the bat. There were 10 reference items shown in the right column, 5 from victims and 5 from suspects who were thought to be likely gang members. So TrueAllele was used by cybergenetics in this timeline. On the first day, we received the evidence data from the 5 crime scenes from the Kern County Laboratory. The next day, we began TrueAllele computer processing. After the first round of results were completed, we then replicated these results to report a result in any sort of DNA match report. We always run the computer at least twice so that we know that the process is working and the results are reproducible. So all of the evidence processing was done, and we were just waiting for the known references. On day 9, we received the known references and can then make an objective comparison on day 10 between the evidence genotypes and the reference genotypes in order to calculate DNA match statistics. And then on the 12th day, we reported the match results in a preliminary report back to the laboratory. So that was sort of the timeline for us working on this case that resembled a sort of a database, in the sense that we had a set of crime scenes with a set of evidence shown geographically across the county. We had a set of suspects, 5 of them in this case, a small database. And then the computer could make comparisons between the genotypes of the evidence items and the suspects. The lines connecting the suspects and the crime scenes show where matches were found. The values ranged from match statistics in the thousands up to the trillions, and we're going to particularly focus on the green line between the second suspect and a counter at a jewelry store. So of the many matches that were found, one of them was a match statistic of 553 million that connected that counter to Dupree Langston. And in November of 2012, a trial began between the people of California and 2 defendants, Charles Lawton and Dupree Langston. The trial went on for 3 months, and in January of this year, there was a TrueAllele admissibility hearing and a trial at which I subsequently testified. I won't go through all of the admissibility evidence that was presented, the case in chief, the cross-exam, and so on. But I will give an indication of just a snapshot of some of the exhibits that were presented. We presented results of peer-reviewed validation studies. Currently, TrueAllele has 5 peer-reviewed validation studies, both on DNA mixtures of known composition as well as on casework samples. We also use these validation studies in order to determine to what extent the match that we observed in this case was something either expected or unexpected. On the x-axis, you see for low template DNA, DNA mixture weights ranging from 0% on the left all the way to 100% on the right. On the y-axis, you see the amount of information. That's the number of zeros in the match statistic. A 6 represents 6 zeros, a 1 followed by 6 zeros, which is a million. A 9 is a billion. A 12 is a 1 followed by 12 zeros, or a trillion. And shown in blue is a scatter plot of how much information was found, represented by the number of zeros in the match statistic, relative to the mixture weight. And what we see shown in a green circle is that the match statistic in this case, for this amount of DNA and the mixture weight of around 40%, is typical. It's an expected result. Expected result, it's not too much, it's not too little. It's what your validation studies tell you you would expect. We also looked at the specificity. This answers the question, or addresses the question, of to what extent do you get a false match? How likely is it that a match statistic of 1 billion would be produced completely by coincidence by TrueAllele? So what we did is we compared the evidence genotypes, the specific evidence genotype used in this match to thousands of random reference profiles. And on the x-axis, horizontally, you see numbers from -30 ranging out to 12. Let me explain what these numbers mean. What say the 9, where the blue circle represents, is a 1 followed by 9 zeros, which is a billion. If you move to the left and you see the -9, that's 1 over a billion. That's evidence for excluding an individual as opposed to including them. If you move further to the left to the average value of -18, that's 1 over a billion billion. That's tremendous evidence for excluding an individual as a contributor to a DNA mixture. So what this shows is if you look at the mass of red distribution, it shows that when you compare the evidence profile in this case that was used to form the match statistic to thousands of just randomly generated profiles, on average, they're excluded with a match statistic of around 1 over a billion billion. And if you move all the way to the right, you see that around 0, there's a little bit of uninformative results, but there's nothing as you move out to a billion. Since the computer inferred this evidence genotype objectively without knowing or considering Mr. Langston genotype, and then made a comparison only afterwards, we can be fairly certain that we're not seeing a false positive and that the result of the process is very specific. I'd like to next show what we presented to the jury. So I have the jury up as an icon in the top left. They're looking down on these slides again. And after first introducing a genotype and the DNA pathway, we then show them data in this case. So from the DNA taken from the countertop at one of the 15 STR loci that are used for genetic analysis, this one's called D8, is the abbreviation, we see a bunch of peaks in front of us, maybe 6 of them. Again, horizontally, it's telling us the size on the x-axis. Vertically, it's telling us how much DNA is present up to random variation. That's the peak height. So the peak of 13 is showing an allele of 13 with a certain amount of DNA. So this is the data that we start with and what the computer has to reason from this locus and all the other loci. We next described how people and human review may make less use of the same data. What most labs currently do is they draw a threshold that's predetermined by laboratory calibrations. Here you see a red line starting on the y-axis at around 150, and that line is drawn across the data. Those peaks that are over the threshold, here 14 and 15, are labeled as allele events, and they're given equal standing. 14 and 15 are both considered to be in without regard to their peak height. And then the peaks that are under the threshold are not used or less used, depending on the specific method, in the analysis. So the quantitative data of patterns is reduced to all or none putative allele events. What the computer does instead is it tries to consider virtually every possible genotype solution, typically tries out 100,000 possibilities, by computer simulation. And the way this works is this. Underneath these colored bars, you can still see the data. There are their peaks going from left to right, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and so on. Those are the peaks that are in the blue curve. That's the original data. What the computer tries to do is to propose genotypes from the three contributors in all different types of allele pairs, different amounts at different locations, and compare the proposed pattern that it gets by adding up these allele pairs from genotypes to the data. So here we see in blue as one person's allele pair, which is the tallest pair of alleles of a 14 and a 15. Then at the next level down, we see another person's allele pair in orange, and that's a 12 and a 13. Further down in green, we see a third person's allele pair in 10 and 16. That's an allele pair. What the computer does is it makes this comparison. This particular pattern with these quantities of allele pair genotypes from these three individuals really explains the data well, and so it has a higher likelihood, and that confers higher probability to each of these three contributor genotypes, the 14-15, the 12-13, and the 10-16. But the computer is also trying out many other patterns of different heights and different amounts, places where the data aren't, places where the data are. Most of those proposals don't have very much probability. Those like these that look like the data pattern get higher probability, and much of what the computer proposes is in between. It sort of looks like the pattern, but not really, and gets intermediate probability. By trying this tens of thousands of times, in this case at least 100,000 times, the computer can map out what those probabilities are for each contributor at each locus for their genotype, and determine a probability distribution. So this is an evidence genotype. The computer has objectively determined this genotype as a probability distribution solely from the DNA data. It's never seen a reference. It's not biased by that. And what you can see is of the possibly 100 possible allele pairs that were in the population to begin with, from maybe the 15 different alleles and their pairwise combinations, the computers reduced this to maybe 15 or so possible allele pair answers, most of which don't have much probability, but some do. At 12-13, there's a 20% probability on the left. At 14-15, about 2/3 of the way over, there's a 51% probability. The y-axis is just probability. These numbers will add up to 100%. At this point, the computer and the process has never seen the suspect. It doesn't know what the answer is. It can't even compute a match statistic because it has nothing to compare with. But this is the sort of information that's numerically written down in TrueAllele's database. And then when a person makes a comparison, they download this evidence genotype together with reference populations and with known references to make a comparison with. So what you're seeing as the new brown bars that are next to the blue bars are the probabilities of a randomly selected person from the population having this genotype. And there are about 100 different values. I'm only showing about the 15 that correspond to the evidence genotype. So now we can compare the evidence genotype shown in blue with the random genotype shown in brown and move just to the spot where the suspect's genotype is, which is a 14. So if you think of that red bar as a slider, we slide over. We could stop anywhere depending on what the suspect's genotype or the victim's genotype would be, but we stop here at 1415 because that's the suspect's genotype, and we ask, how much more does the suspect match the evidence than a random person? And what the math of likelihood ratios and the DNA match statistic lets us do is take the ratio of the blue bar, the evidence genotype probability, divide by the height of the brown bar that's right next to it inside that red rectangle, and that ratio of 51% to 6% is the probability of an evidence match relative to coincidence, which in this case is about 8, and that is visually and accurately the match statistic. There's more than one locus. We didn't just look at D8 because the lab produced data for all 15 STR loci. On the x-axis, you see the match statistic in 5, 10, 15, 20, whatever that ratio is of specific match to coincidence. And on the y-axis, you see the 15 different loci. Multiplying those 15 numbers together, we arrive at the joint match statistic for all of the loci, and we can answer the question, is the suspect in the evidence? And we can then state in a report and a trial that a match between the front counter and Dupree-Langston is 553 million times more probable than a coincidental match to an unrelated black person. And statistics are given for other ethnic groups as well. There was a well-done news clip by Bakerfield NBC affiliate, and they did an excellent job of summarizing in 2.5 minutes what this case was about and what was found. So let's see their presentation.
New at 5:30, prosecutors are hailing new DNA technology that helped secure 2 convictions in a string of recent robberies.
The new TrueAllele casework system made its debut in a Kern County courtroom this month. 17's Kiyoshi Tomono shows you how it works.
Charles Lawton and Dupree-Langston might have gotten away with robbing this check advance store if they hadn't done this, planting a bare hand on this countertop to vault over. In the fraction of a second Langston's sweaty palm touched the counter, it transferred a minute amount of DNA that would lead to his conviction.
And so then the technicians went back to that very spot and did some swabs.
Before, the crime lab might have struggled to do anything with evidence like this. Only a trace amount of DNA and contamination from other people who touched the same counter.
And that used to be the biggest problem, was when you had a mixture of profiles. And so you couldn't pull out exactly who was in there, who wasn't in there.
So in those cases, we would have to say that the DNA profiles were inconclusive in our analysis. With TrueAllele, we don't have to say that any longer.
TrueAllele is high-powered computer software that uses mathematical formulas to sort through contaminated evidence.
This is the first use of TrueAllele west of the Mississippi, really.
It can then pinpoint with a high level of confidence whether a particular person's DNA was present at the scene of a crime, even if they barely brushed an item.
We're talking about touch DNA. We're talking about DNA with that's been out in the field for a while and maybe degraded. We're talking about missing persons cases, potentially.
It is a powerful tool with a caveat.
DNA, it is time-consuming and it is expensive. And so we can't do it for every case that we would like to.
In all, Lawton and Langston were convicted of 8 robberies in a 5-week crime spree, including a holdup at this Max Muscle store in 2011, where the owner shot back. Other victims said they were brutalized. Some were even forced to disrobe at gunpoint. Now that the technology has been proven in court, the crime lab says expect to see more of it.
With newer technologies, we're able to give more definitive answers.
In downtown Bakersfield, Kiyoshi Tomono, 17 News.
And a footnote here, Langston and Lawton are set to be sentenced on April 5th. They each face about 70 years in state prison. The new DNA software, by the way, was paid for with a $100,000 grant from the National Institute of Justice.
So that's one example of a criminal trial the TrueAllele was used in. TrueAllele has been reported in over 100 case reports filed on DNA evidence, typically complex mixtures. I and others have given court testimony in state court, federal court, military court-martial, and in foreign courts for crimes that they tend to be serious crimes like that are violent, armed robbery, child abduction, child molestation, murder, rape, terrorism, weapons possession, and so on. TrueAllele is becoming more widely used in the United States. This map of the states is color-coded. Let me explain that. The casework system has been purchased by laboratories shown in the states colored in blue and green. Interpretation services, where the lab doesn't have a system, but we work directly for prosecutors or defense attorneys, has been used in states indicated in orange and in green, and in some of the blue states as well. And admissibility hearings have been held in California, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, where the evidence then went on to be used at the trial. Currently, in Pennsylvania, the state enjoys an appellate court precedent establishing TrueAllele as a reliable technology. So I wanted to touch on one last point before we close. There's the issue of interpreting evidence and how that impacts on DNA databases. Currently, most groups in the US and throughout the world are relying on older 20th century DNA database technology. This is based on the inclusion methods that often result in inconclusive answers and no match statistics or lower match statistics. On the right side, we see that reference samples from criminals can, or convicted offenders, can be readily uploaded to an allele database where allele pairs or genotypes aren't used, but lists of alleles are. And that works perfectly well for references, for comparing references against references, like in immigration. But moving to the left side, if you want to upload your evidence from crime scenes, you have to handle mixtures. And currently, the way databases in most government labs in the US address that is by not uploading most of the mixtures. We've polled some labs that can range from 80 to 90% of the crime scene mixtures never going up to the database. Well, obviously, if they're not inferred and uploaded to the allele database, there'll be no matching, comparison, reporting, or detection of criminals from crime scenes that have such mixtures. A 21st century DNA database approach is to use all available technology, math, and computers, and to use a genotype database that separates the mixtures out into the component genotypes and mathematically and accurately represents the uncertainty with probability. And as you saw, the math all works to compute match statistics. So the result is that the broken pathway of allele DNA databases are restored by these genotype databases, and the crime scene evidence from all data, all mixtures, can be uploaded into the genotype databases. You may ask, well, what about the possibility of having false hits, which can occur? Is the reason why the allele databases, the older types, don't let evidence onto their database. And the answer is that by doing extensive validation studies, we can show, and we have shown, that comparing genotypes from mixtures of any type, informative or uninformative relative to references does not produce a false hit following confirmation in TrueAllele. So you get the benefit of having all the sensitivity of getting all mixture evidence uploaded into a database, along with the specificity of not having the false hits. And the result is more accurate and more precise DNA databases based on genotypes and math instead of lists of alleles and heuristics. So to sum up, we're in a computer age that TrueAllele is participating in. The purpose of TrueAllele is to be an objective, reliable, truth-seeking tool. That was the design goal when we began working on it almost 15 years ago, and it's still the goal of this tool today. It was designed to solve the DNA mixture problem, and currently we routinely, in our service work, solve 4 and 5 DNA mixtures. It handles low copy and degraded DNA through math modeling. It provides accurate DNA match statistics that have been validated by comparison with human review and by laboratories. And it automates most of the DNA evidence interpretation. It does the heavy lifting of the calculations and the flow of information, and trained TrueAllele experts can then work with this tool in order to ask questions of the computer and understand what those answers are, write reports, and testify in court. And TrueAllele is currently used to eliminate DNA backlogs, reduce forensics costs, solve crimes, find criminals, convict the guilty, also free the innocent, and create a safer society through more informed technology. So for more information, we have a lot of material on our website under the Information tab. We have courses for prosecutors, lawyers, and for forensic analysts, newsletters, a newsroom with events. We have many presentations that are uploaded from conferences. There's a tab there, and most of the recent ones have narrated PowerPoints if you can't attend all the meetings that we present at. And our publications are uploaded there as well. The most recent one is the November 2013 validation study done together with New York State that will be published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences on validating DNA mixture interpretation. That is open access, so you can read it and download it today. If you'd like to send data or get more information, these are addresses where you can contact us. Thank you very much for your interest and attention.